Hey everyone. A word before we start today. I This conversation surrounding Gaza, Israel, Palestine, so on and so forth. It's certainly a controversial way to go about discussing international politics. I guess as I think about it, the more that we discuss these issues, the more we're actually doing the work of contributing towards some sort of resolution, whatever that is. And I want to do that with care and the knowledge that anything that I say isn't complete. I don't know all the backstories. I don't know all the context. I don't know all the histories. I don't know all the continuing stories. But what I do know is that fundamentally, as humans, we're driven to try and find peace. Or at least we should seek it. Most of us should be seeking it. I would hope that we're all seeking it. But by that same measure, I can understand how different creeds and ideologies and things of those natures can contribute to us feeling spread out, dissonant, unfulfilled, and desperate to a certain extent. So, when I speak today, I want to hold space for that, just as I want to for the points that I try and make. I hope you'll join me on this constructive discovery, and I hope you'll consider the actions of all as we move into a conversation that needs to be had and continues needing to be had. So, without further ado, I invite you to like, share, and of course rate the podcast before we start. And with that said, let's get right on into it. This is Podtax. Hi, everyone. My name is Cameron, and this is Podtax. We're going to take when I tried to put show notes together for this sort of thing, it was one of those topics that there's no real good way to have this conversation in a way that's objectively fair to the whole list of facts. Because when we talk about international relations and we talk about, okay, what do we see as what one side wants versus the other side wants? And when we discuss something of such sensitive natures, like what's going on in the Middle East, it doesn't leave a whole lot of room for context insofar as considering one side or the other. Because each side, such as they are, is committing acts of violence in ways that, well, redefine our scope of imagination when it comes to how people die. So let's be fundamentally clear about a few things. One, hostages by both sides should not be taken and should be released. We can advocate for that. Two, what's going on the Gaza Strip and to the Palestinian people is a genocide. Three, it is also true that the aggression by Hamas against Israel should be condemned and considered it incited Israel. Doesn't make any of it right. Doesn't make any of it right. Last week, an IDF tank fired into a group of civilians looking for food on the Gaza Strip. Yesterday, someone in Boulder, Colorado, threw an incendiary device and had a makeshift flamethrower. And they threw the device into a crowd of protesters who were advocating for the release of Israeli hostages that were kept in Gaza. This comes after last week, where 2 people were shot and killed outside, I believe it was a Jewish museum in Washington. Or at least these were part of the Israeli delegation. I don't have the exact facts, but they had something to do. They were part of like the Israeli diplomatic office, and they were outside a Jewish museum. In both cases, the assailants shouted, "Free Palestine," before attempting to take lives, innocent lives. Now, does that compare to the sheer number of civilians that have been crushed in Gaza? No, it doesn't. And we shouldn't be trying to compare the two. But the fact that we have a tank firing on civilians, and then we have people throwing fire bombs and attacking just people going about their business. Blame can be held for all sides of the issue. And that doesn't mean that we can't decry what's happening in Gaza as a genocide, because it most certainly is. And that doesn't mean we can claim that Israel shouldn't be able to defend themselves from Hamas, who is, can be considered a terrorist organization. It's conflict that begets conflict, that begets conflict, that begets conflict for time and time and time again. And I'm not the agency to really discuss that. I'm not Jewish, I'm not Muslim, I don't really have a stake in this fight, but from what I see and hear and listen to and try and take in, the world keeps moving, and maybe, just maybe, these words can help move something along that can contribute towards a resolution. Because no matter what side of the aisle that you can subscribe to, and I think that this conflict can be used as a lens for something that is far greater in our society. That is the conflict that turns into violence between 2 parties. And you're like, well, isn't that just war? Isn't that just... Yes, it's Russia and Ukraine, it's India and Pakistan, it's Democrats and Republicans, it's everything. It's so dissonant that in our capacity to exist and make our world a better place, do we also hold space for wanton death and destruction and mayhem and madness? And it's sickening. To think that someone actively had an idea to go out and throw a firebomb at people who just wanted hostages released, to carry with them a flamethrower of all things, or to know that there was someone sitting in a tank who got an order, I assume, to fire on civilians. Our capacity for evil as a species is profound. We like to think that we're good people. We like to believe that eventually the good shines through. But it doesn't in the moment. And maybe it's not that good is an end result, but maybe the good is part of a cycle of an ebb and flow of morality that comes to exist. Because if good were the end result of everything, how did the Holocaust come to pass? Like, what comes from that? If good is the end game, how can something like the Holocaust exist? Because there is nothing that can equate to that in terms of goodness. Millions and millions and millions of lives cruelly displaced and shattered by an oppressive regime who sought to scapegoat and press their fallible things onto other people. And now we see it today with administrations who are trying to use prejudice against groups that they don't understand. Trans people, other people, migrants. It's sickening. And it goes back to this conflict that goes on in the Middle East, this never-ending conflict that was in part instigated by some severe lack of foresight way back in the day when Israel was formed. And I'm not saying that the Jewish people aren't deserving of a state, but the way in which it was formed, where it, we could go back into the historical record and be like how this land was basically just annexed, and we're not trying to provide a salve for the misguided efforts of the past, or at least what we can do is say that they were done without tact and without consideration, and the relationships that have cropped up over the course of decades, half a century now, continue to propagate because the people at hand deferred the responsibility to future generations. Maybe that's what it's all about. Maybe it's that deference, the fact that people will be like, well, this might cause a problem, I'm just going to hand it off. It's not my problem to worry about. Maybe that's the real evil of all of this, the inability to take responsibility for the actions of our wards, our people, our thoughts and feelings, to say, well, this doesn't affect me. The empathy that we choose not to hold for future generations and for our contemporaries in society dooms our status quo. And we see it now with different ways of thinking, right? The person who says, well, I only care about what affects me. My own circle of influence, I don't want to pay tax. I don't want to do any of this. The government can't tell me what to do because all I care about is what affects me. And how short-sighted is that? To see someone who says such a thing and to have that to see someone with such cognitive dissonance that their ability to not carry empathy for other people or the plights of others, where did we go wrong? I don't know how we got here, but I think that I know, at least some part of me does, that having that empathy, having that consideration, being able to put ourselves into this collective social contract and understand that we exist not as just one person, one family, one sect of a society, but as a greater whole, a greater subset, a greater essence of this population of humanity that exists on this pale blue dot, that we aren't alone. That everything that we say and do matters to the collective good. I'd really like to believe that there's a solution there, but it's at this point, when eras of fighting and stratification and extremism and polarization come to pass, how do we return to that? I think, dear listener, that maybe the simplest thing we can do is to ask why. Because the great thing about science is that science doesn't care what we think, and science is objective truth. And the way that we uncover things and discover that objective truth is by asking why. Why does this happen? And we do that so well for all of the little things in our life that we want to find the minutiae around. Our new products, our new ways of thinking, our new anything that can be abstracted to the scientific method. Maybe it's time we consider it for ourselves and our social sphere. Maybe it is just as simple as asking someone, why do you believe that? And then not shying away from the conversation that follows. Because the answer can infuriate us. The answer can make us feel as if we, the seekers of good and truth and justice in society, are ostracized. When in reality, it's the fact that the people that can't hold space for it are lacking of some emotional intelligence to be able to hold those considerations. And that can make them really frustrating to deal with. But it doesn't make the conversation any less important. Because asking why, in and of itself, is not a method by which to accuse. Asking why is an invitation that it allows the person, place, or thing to be accountable to themselves. Because maybe, just maybe, these people haven't had time or taken the opportunity to ask themselves those questions. And by asking those questions and facilitating those conversations, the ones that matter happen between the person themselves and the idea. Why do I want these people to hurt? Why do I not care outside of my own specific sphere of influence? Why do I believe what I believe, and what does that make me? This is the question we need everyone asking. Everyone asking themselves, that is. And we can facilitate that. We can challenge people. It's courageous and brave to do that. And it's most necessary, especially in a time of such polarization. It's uncomfortable, sure. That's the whole nature of what this process is. That's the reality of the situation that we live in. Because in such polarization, people are so ingrained with what they believe that they don't even bother to ask why. They just subscribe and move on in a very black and white way of thinking. And we need to remove that. That isn't to say that there aren't some objective truths about life. That isn't to say that we can't find some sort of truth and peace and justice amidst all of it, but we also can go on to admit that everything does carry nuance and everything does have a complicated story, and we can still say that something is objectively, morally wrong, even if the situation by which we got there doesn't seem as such. Was Israel right to retaliate when Hamas attacked them many years ago? Yeah. Just as everyone in Gaza has a right to live free from Israeli oppression, from this indiscriminate carpet bombing, from this horrible, horrible genocide. It's tough. It's tough to go into these conversations with a measure of empathy that can hold space for all sides. We can think about, I guess the best example of this is the German soldier in World War II. The ones who were just part of the German army at that time, who may not have been Nazis necessarily in their heart of hearts, but served their nation. And they are complicit with some of the greatest atrocities that we've ever known. But these people didn't start out that way. They're still human beings. Everyone is a human being. Until they lose their humanity, I suppose. And I guess that might be where the line needs to be drawn. At the disregard for the notion that others turn away from others' humanity and don't hold space for that, and see people as an other, to be eradicated, to be sent away from this earthly veil of existence. That's where the line is drawn. To say, when others hit the point of no return and say, I am going to persecute this other group of people because they fundamentally infringe upon how I exist, and that is just wrong. Conflicts happen and war is atrocious, but war will continue ever onward as humanity exists. And war is fought it's fought by the people, but at the end of the day, it's just a board game for the higher ups and the nations themselves. It's never going to go away, not so long as there are resources to be finite. That includes land, that includes actual resource, and it will very likely include things like water in the coming years. War will continue. Conflict will continue. But we can also understand that there are people on both sides who carry an innocence about them, who are serving out of duty of country or some other right that makes them feel like they're doing the right thing. So long as it's not for the simple fact that they are actively trying to eradicate other human beings. And I don't know, man, with the tank firing, with the firebombing, maybe we're further away from where we need to be than I realized. But I have hope. It's slim. It's not much of a hope, but it's slim. I think what the hope really means, though, is that people are willing to do the work to speak out. People are willing to hold space for the tough conversations. People are willing to ask why and be aware and hold consideration for the simple fact that things aren't just so black and white. And that, yes, there are some things that are objectively wrong, but beyond those, there's a nuance. And we can also say that, maybe there's truth somewhere in the middle. Until, of course, it reaches the point of no return. And we see other humans treating other humans like they're not humans. It's so confusing. And it's so frustrating. But that doesn't make the work to stop it any less valid. I can put out this podcast and it can get 10 views, and you know what? That's okay. Half of those don't even have to listen to the whole thing. But it's a step in the right direction, even if it's a small one. And maybe that the collective journey of 1,000 miles is filled with steps taken by all of us, and not just singular persons. I think perhaps that's how we all get to a collective good spot within the social contract. Because that's what it is. The social contract is not meant for one person or one group. It's meant for all of us. It's meant to be this collective understanding and pursuit of good and peace that we can all live by. And that, being able to uphold that, takes all of us. Today, tomorrow, ever onward. Because even when we do achieve some semblance of peace, we are reminded that we are only but a few feet away from just falling right back into the cycle of conflict. And that, I think, is the tough part to reconcile, is the fact that the cycle of conflict will continue, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's here back in the States, somewhere else on Earth. I'm sure that we'll start warring with Mars when we eventually colonize. But to defer that, to say that these problems aren't ours because they may not affect us, is irresponsible to the highest degree. Like I said at the beginning, the conflict between Israel and Gaza and the Palestinians is not something that directly affects my life. And yet, we are all responsible for this collective push towards finding common ground. It's being willing to ask our own selves, why am I standing aside? What am I afraid of? Why am I that, I think, is the beauty of what this age of information can do. Because while the age of platforms gives everyone a space to put out their own voice and their own message, it also means that every single one of those messages can contribute to something. It also means that everyone who is willing to say something has the right to do so and should, if it's in pursuit of something that benefits all. And the hope is that somewhere along the way, the people that take up those platforms don't adulterate them to utilize those platforms to say that what is good and what benefits all is by ostracizing a scapegoat. No, it's not through putting the blame onto others. It's taking responsibility of the situations that we find ourselves in and trying to work towards some sort of collective resolution. And that can be war or climate change or a dispute you have with your neighbor. What we need to do and continue to learn how to do is to take the reins of our agency of information and actually push forward with the notion that we want to contribute to something better, something free, something peaceful, something that is beneficial. And that means decrying tank blasts and incendiary devices. It means calling out the genocide of what's going on in Gaza for what it is, and it also holds space for the fact that Israel is in their rights to defend themselves, except when they go too far, like they have. So, dear listener, today I invite you to consider your own space and your own role within the world itself. Because evil doesn't rest, and neither should we. I ask you to ask yourself why. Why do you stand aside? Why do you care? Why are you willing to fight for what's right and show up when it matters? Because the answer to those questions affects us all. With that, I'll sign up for the day. Thank you for listening to this Podtax. Be sure to like, share, and of course subscribe if you feel these messages are worth spreading. My name is Cameron, and I'll see you next time, here on Podtax.